Welcome to Global Business Environment, and today we're looking at the PowerPoint slides that focuses on P6. So what we will do is we will first look at breaking down the question. When we're looking at the question, we're going to look at the keywords, breaking down the question, and seeing what things that we need to answer. We're going to be looking at various decision criteria for deciding, what type of route you should take. Next, we're going to be looking at the different types of routes, and then we'll be looking at the different barriers to internationalization. Most companies, when they start off at a certain size, they may just focus domestically on their home market because it's what they know. They may start off as one shop and then they may eventually grow throughout their whole country. We've seen cases like Tesco's with Jack Cohen in 1919 started one Tesco store after the First World War, and then he built up to many different Tesco stores in the UK, and now we have superstores, online stores, metro stores, express stores, ultra stores, and we have Tesco stores all over the UK and different types of stores for different types of needs. And eventually Tesco started and went abroad. They're in 9 other countries, and how they decide to go abroad is dependent upon the various factors. Which route should they take? So we're going to look at some of these things. Even if we look at Zara started off with one shop in Spain. So one shop in Spain, and then now they've got over 2,000 stores in over 90 different countries. So, how do they want to decide how they're going to expand when they do decide to go international or global? So when we're looking, we are first going to focus on the question, and the question says to determine and articulate the various routes to internationalization an organization may adopt, including key barriers. So words first, and the key word here is to determine. So to determine means to ascertain, establish, or discover. And then as well, if we're going to look at the question, how would we try and answer this question? So if we were going to try and answer this question, one possible way would be first to look at what is internationalization, and we've done that before in P1 when we looked at globalization, and we also compared globalization, which we saw was the breaking down of barriers for the free movement of goods and services and people between countries without barriers, whereas internationalization, you may have different barriers and tariffs between countries. So again, you would start off with explaining what internationalization was. Then you may determine, when you're going to go or decide to go international. Are you going to be going international? Or are you going to be going global? Many different countries. How are you going to decide to go, and what criteria are you determining or basing that on? We will look at different routes, maybe review the pros and cons of each, and then obviously we need to look at the barriers of each as well, because the barriers, as stated in the question, including key barriers. And obviously throughout your work it would be good to extenuate points by providing examples of different companies, so that would be good as well. Okay, so and the question comes back to when, where, what, who, how, and why. I can remember when I worked for my first company, Metro Products. They were selling Stop Look, a mechanical steering wheel immobilizer, and we were doing very well in the UK, and the company was turning over £4 million, importing the products, the component parts, and assembling them in the UK. and we had various stockists, including Halfords, B&Q's, Texas, Motor World's, A1 Motor Stores up and down the country. But the company was growing so big, eventually the company wanted to look at exporting to other countries, France, Germany, America, the US, because mechanical steering wheel or stopping the theft of your car was applicable to many different markets. So how how would they do it? Why do they want to do it? When were they going to do it? Where were they going to do it? So all these questions would need to be asked. So what is a few factors to how much ownership you want and how much control you want. And I think the ownership and the control in terms of going into another country will then translate into the degree of risk or the degree of investment a company would actually put into that business in terms of expanding into another country, be it international or from a global perspective. So there are various so these are the factors that we need to bear in mind: ownership, control, which translates into risk, because the more control that you might want is the more investment that you might want, which is not guaranteed necessarily to a foregone conclusion for it to be a success, and then all that investment could be lost, and therefore could affect your bottom line. We've seen many examples, like in the case of Tesco's going into America, trying to compete with Walmart, and eventually having to leave the US with a £2 billion loss. So, well, we've got various routes, including licensing. Well, what is licensing? Licensing is a contractual arrangement where one company, licensor, provides technology, know-how, patents, or a successful brand to another company, licensee, in exchange for royalties and fees. When we look at this, we can see this with an example of going to be managed contracts. So when we look at managed contracts, bear with me, we can see managed contracts is really an arrangement under which an operational control of an enterprise is vested by contract in a separate enterprise that performs the necessary managerial functions in return for a fee. The management contracts involves not just selling a method or doing things as like franchising or licensing, but involves actually doing them. A management contract can involve a wide range of functions such as technical operations and production facility management of personnel, accounting, marketing services and training. So again, with the management contracts, we can see the difference between these exhibiting more control over the firm carrying out what you want them to carry out for a contracted fee. So when we see joint ventures are, again, the difference here is the level of ownership, because now if you're going into a joint venture, you may not own 100% of the venture. So the ownership would be a lot less in terms of the amount. So you may give away 50% if you were going into 50-50 with a joint venture in another country, or you may decide that you want to own the majority of the shares within the company. But either way, the joint venture will involve two or more people within the business or companies within the business to come together to go into another country. Again, the degrees of risk here, that it's very important to make sure that you're on the same mind and everyone knows exactly what they're doing and everyone agrees to the game plan, because when disagreements happen, then that's when it causes ownership and shared alliances. Ownership is when, here again you have more of the ownership than a joint venture, and a joint venture would have more of the ownership than a license, franchise, or management contracts. But with ownership, you may decide that you've got a manufacturing plant, or you've got McDonald's in one country, and you may want to set up not a franchise, but you want to set up your own McDonald's retail store, food stores in another country, in Moscow, which is owned by McDonald's. Here you would have 100% of control and 100% of ownership. But again, the ownership and control relate to the degree of risk, because you have to invest, you have to train, you have to do all the marketing, and nothing is a foregone conclusion, and nothing is certain to say that it is going to be a success and you are going to make the degree of profit that you want to make by opening that store in another country. So yes, you do have greater ownership and you do have more control in terms of the way things are presented, the way your staff carry out their functions, how you the organizational culture, how you do everything. But whether or not it's a success is another case, as seen with the case with Tesco's. Again, with Tesco's, when they went into America, they had to compete with Walmart, and one of the few problems was that Walmart was established, but two, the portion sizes of Tesco's were so small, they were very much childlike because the American people have predominantly a bigger proportion of food sizes, and food sizes as presented by Tesco's wasn't deemed to be appropriate to what the end consumer in America would actually deem as a adult's meal. For a variety of different reasons, Tesco's didn't work, and then even though they had 100% of ownership and 100% of control, they lost $2 billion because eventually it was unsustainable and they had to pull out. So yes, look at this, we are talking about moving goods moving goods from one place to another, and the question and these the movement of goods and services and people and technology does cost in terms of a variety of cost, shipping and so on. When we look at international routes, then as we said before, there is licensing. One company provides a brand know-how to another company for fees and royalties. Agreements where a firm permits its name, logo, design, and operations to be used by an established new firm. Again, we said franchising and licensing are very similar, but the main difference between these two is the level of control. With a franchise agreement, you have more control, but less ownership than a joint venture, but more than a license agreement. Contracts, again, managed contracts, the firm manages your operations for a fee, and again, you have 100% say in terms of how you want things to be done. It's run by two or more, but the risk is shared, and you have strengths of being combined, shared ownership, which could be good because you're bringing knowledge and information together, and you're diversifying the risk, but means less profits. Ownership, creation of a new facility investor with greater flexibility, greater 100% ownership, and with 100% control, but with all the risk involved into investing into another country. Look at the key barriers, because part of the question said what were the different routes to internationalization. Well, and the other part of the question was, well, what are some of the when we look at the different forms of different routes, licensing, again, in terms of the different routes, licensing, you would have minimal control in terms of how things are done, and how your product is being portrayed and where it's being sold. Franchising could fail due to a lack of funds, poor people skills, or poor management. So franchises are not always guaranteed to actually succeed. Contract management may suffer from poor quality and control over products. Joint ventures, again, question of control, culture clashes, different objectives, again, very important to make sure that both companies know exactly what they're doing, where they're going, and who's doing what. Ownership and shared alliances could be costly in the setup process, and as we stated before, there is no guarantee for success in the setup process. But there are other barriers. These barriers include, social and culture. When you're going into another country, what are the social and cultural barriers? Because different people may want different things, and the needs of the customers may be different. When we look at the economic and social, we can see that the economic and social again, the pricing of the product, are the profit margins there to price the goods at that price in that marketplace. When we look at the legal and political, what other factors could actually stop it? Is it a stable legal environment? What about the political environment of that country, like the UK, where the UK wanted Brexit, and now we've got Brexit, what does it actually mean for those firms in the UK, like Toyota? Are they going to move their production firm? Are they going to include tariff costs on Toyota's cars being exported into Europe? And if so, is that going to increase the cost? So what will be the reply by Toyota? Will they move the production site into Europe, and so on and so forth? What are the political factors? So we are looking at these different routes, and we are considering the level of ownership and the level of control one has. And we're looking at the different types in terms of license agreements, franchise agreements, managed contracts, joint ventures, um, you know, uh, ownership in another country. And it all boils down to the level of investment and the level of risk that you want to take. When we're looking at the barriers, you've also got language barriers, values, religious barriers, currency shifts. If we take the example of the fact that the UK was leading up going into Brexit, the value of the pound fell. So the value of the pound fell, which meant that imported foods coming from Europe into the UK now cost more. So what do companies do? So if the cost of goods costs more, you have your sales minus your cost of goods with increased cost of goods, which means that your gross profit is going to be smaller, or your gross profit percentage margin is going to be smaller. So what do? You either increase your sales of your products, but then if you increase the sales of your products, then you may become uncompetitive in relation to your competition. Or you can try and negotiate better prices on your cost of goods sold, which will be difficult. Or you can try and make cost savings within your business model. So, again, economic barriers, shifts, currency shifts, very important to the cost of goods, which can affect your profit and loss account and therefore ultimately affect your bottom line. Legal and political, international, what are the regulations? What are the trade restrictions? Trade wars between the US and China, where, Donald Trump has increased tariffs on various goods, or American goods going into China, and China has retaliated by increasing to the same degree the level of tariff barriers going from China into America, hurting both companies, but also hurting those companies who are trading back and forth from America to China. When we look at or companies, we can see, what are some of the barriers? Some of the barriers from a company perspective will be, do you actually have the management skills? The management skills to operate in another country. Another barrier will be the distance, transportation costs, transfer costs. There will be government tariffs, protection policies that we've seen. tariffs imposed by exports or import tariffs. Likewise, the rise of quotas and the protection of insufficient industry. So, there may be protectionist policies like France and their farming industry, where their farming industry obviously is subsidized by the EU, and the farming industry is, I don't know, it's not really sustainable. It doesn't really justify the amount of money that's being put in there. Again, when we look at the barriers, you can see the barriers, from a company perspective. You can see, from an internal perspective, you can see the barriers from a pastel type perspective, from political, economic, social, technological type perspective. And, so these factors from an internal and external perspective needs to be taken. Now, today we've looked at, looking at the question, different routes to internationalization and the key barriers of these. And we've looked at that and the key words. We've looked at the decision making in terms of thinking about the degree of ownership and the degree of control, which translates into the degree of risk, which will determine which way you're going to go, if it's a license, franchise, managed contract, joint venture, total ownership, in terms of which way you want to go. Again, that doesn't come into it. Decision making tools and BMW example. Okay, thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful from Mr. Tan.